The opposition pledges to approve the North West gas shelf extension within a month if it wins the election. The government dismisses it as worse than a thought bubble. I'm Patricia Karvelas, live from the lands of the Wurundjeri people in Melbourne. Welcome to Afternoon Briefing. Opposition leader Peter Dutton has vowed to fast-track the approval process of the North West Shelf gas plant extension, which would see it operate until 2070. Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek is yet to approve the new timeline, which has WA government backing, with the deadline due at the end of the month. Would a fast-tracked approval meet environmental regulations? I'll ask local independent MP Kate Chaney later this hour. Russian President Vladimir Putin has agreed to pause attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure while negotiations for a permanent ceasefire take place after a phone call with the US President Donald Trump. Now, Mr. Putin says the nation will only agree to a ceasefire if the US and its allies stop providing arms and military intelligence to Ukraine. So is this a step towards peace? I'll ask the Shadow Foreign Minister David Coleman in just a moment. And migrants applying to become Australians would be asked about their attitudes towards Jewish people in a change to the citizenship test proposed by the opposition. It follows Peter Dutton's proposal to pursue a referendum on stripping Australian citizenship from dual nationals if they have committed a serious crime. Is this actual coalition policy or just some ideas? I'll ask the Nationals Senate leader Bridget McKenzie. Let's start on international affairs. Defence Minister Richard Marles says he welcomes Russia's move to halt attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, but doesn't want to see Russia rewarded for its invasion in peace negotiations.
What's now important is that Russia cannot be rewarded in the way in which this plays out in terms of peace negotiations, and that would be our concern at this moment. Yes, we want to see a peace. It cannot be peace on any terms, though, and ultimately we will stand with Ukraine until Ukraine can resolve this dispute on their terms.
Meanwhile, in the Middle East, world leaders have called for the end of violence in Gaza after a series of Israeli strikes yesterday, which killed more than 400 people. The move has threatened to end a 2-month ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. The United States has indicated it supported and was consulted on Israel's actions. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the nation, saying the strikes were necessary to getting hostages home.
To those who criticize Israel, I ask, what would you do if terrorists murdered and kidnapped your children? You would do what we are doing. In the face of pure evil, free societies have no choice but to fight. So I want to assure all our friends around the world, Israel will fight and Israel will win.
Well, to talk about these issues and some domestic ones too, let's bring in the Shadow Foreign Minister, David Coleman. David Coleman, welcome to the program.
Good afternoon, Patricia.
There has been a resumption of hostilities in Gaza. In your view, is the war now back on?
Well, look, nobody wants to see a conflict in the Middle East. No one wants to see conflict in Gaza, and we obviously have great empathy for the innocent victims. The issue is, Patricia, that Hamas is holding hostages. Hamas must release those hostages. It had an offer to do so from the United States, which it rejected, and it continues its barbaric behaviour. And it needs to return those hostages, and that's the way to get the ceasefire back in place.
You talk about those hostages, but it's actually the families of hostages in Gaza that say they're terrified they won't return because of these attacks. So the hostage families themselves don't see it as a useful or positive contribution to reuniting with their loved ones.
Yeah, and the hostage families are in the most horrible of situations, and it's almost impossible to conceive of the pain that they're going through. But the bottom line here, Patricia, is Hamas committed mass murder against Israel. They killed more than 1,000 people. They want conflict. They want people to die. And they can resolve this conflict by returning the hostages they should have done so, well, they should never have been taken, but they should have been returned a long time ago. And that's what needs to happen. And Hamas could do that tomorrow. But they don't want to because they want this conflict to continue, and that is evil.
The strikes killed mostly women and children. Does that concern you?
Of course, any time when innocent people are killed, Patricia, it's very concerning. And obviously we all, our heart goes out to any innocent victims in any conflict. But again, why is the conflict occurring? The conflict is occurring because Hamas committed mass murder, because Hamas has not returned the hostages, and because Hamas wants conflict to continue and wants to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. That's the reality. And so Hamas can stop the conflict by returning the hostages, and that's what needs to happen. And they're refusing to do that, and that needs to change.
You say Hamas wants to continue the conflict. We've heard some pretty alarming things that have come out of the ministers in the Israeli cabinet as well. It seems that some people want the conflict to continue from the Israeli side as well.
Well, I think what people in Israel understandably want is their hostages returned, and they also don't want a situation where Hamas can walk into Israel and kill innocent people and do so deliberately as an actual strategy to walk into another country and murder as many people as you possibly can. That is the definition of evil. That is what Israel has had to deal with. And Hamas continues to hold those hostages. We've seen those barbaric handovers of hostages, including the coffins of children, Patricia, which I think shocked the world in terms of the barbarity of Hamas. And what Hamas needs to do now is get those hostages back to their families.
Are you concerned that the resumption of the conflict will lead to more social disharmony and inflamed domestic tensions here in Australia?
Look, I think there's obviously a lot of people in Australia who are concerned about the conflict, and that's understandable. But again, why is the conflict happening? It's happening because Hamas killed more than 1,000 Israelis, because Hamas continues to hold hostages, and that has to stop. They have to be returned, and that's where the focus needs to be, Patricia, on the evil of Hamas and the capacity for Hamas to get the ceasefire recommenced by returning those hostages.
David Coleman, I want to change the topic and just talk about a few domestic issues if we can. Have coalition MPs been told to pour cold water on the prospect of a referendum to allow ministers to deport dual nationals?
Look, Patricia, I think on this issue, let's strip this issue back to its essence. Peter Dutton has a very strong track record of standing up and protecting Australians. He cancelled more than 6,000 visas when in government. Why did he do that? Because he is incredibly focused on the safety of our community, the safety of families and the safety of children. That's a good thing. Now, some people might not like that. I think it's a good thing. And so what Peter is saying is, of course, we need to look at all options. And if we've got situations where people are committing acts of terror, or where people are committing acts of violence against children, or acts of exploitation of children, he's saying all options have to be on the table, and we'll review those in government.
But shouldn't we know now, because we know what the High Court thinks. We already know that. It's actually crystal clear. So given we do know that, will you commit to a referendum if you're elected in the next term?
Well, what we're saying, Patricia, is we'll look very carefully at the operation of all laws and how effective they are in defending Australians. Why wouldn't we do that? We will do that. And we will lean forward in protecting the Australian community. That's what Peter Dutton has always done. And he's often been criticised by the left of politics for doing so, but he doesn't care because it's the right thing to do.
So is having a referendum in your next term the right thing to do?
Well, Patricia, as I said, we'll look at all the entire situation, the effectiveness or otherwise of our laws.
But don't we already know? Because, as I say, the High Court has been clear, so we already know. So it's either you think there should be a referendum or you don't.
Well, again, Patricia, we'll review the situation in government, but we won't shy away from taking strong action to defend Australians, whether it's from terrorists, from people who are committing acts of violence against children, or other forms of despicable crime. And to be frank, Patricia, I think most people in the Australian community would want their government to do that. We've got a Labor government that has released people from detention in large numbers, that has had a lax approach to border security, that won't do anything about things like people publishing videos online celebrating their crimes. Labor thinks there's no need for any law to deal with that. Very weak on crime. And we have a different view.
Okay. Today's talking points that have been published, you can see them on the ABC website right now, they reiterate that there's no plans to hold a referendum. So is that the position?
Well, Patricia, as I said, we'll review the situation after we come into government, and as Peter Dutton has said today, we'll take the action that we think is necessary.
Okay, so after reviewing it, sorry, I just want to nail down the detail, because I think people are entitled to know, genuinely entitled to know. You'd review it, you'd make a judgment if you think it's necessary to go to a referendum, and then would you take that to another election? Is that like a second term proposition then in terms of when we would go to a national vote?
Yeah, Patricia, I think I've addressed your question on multiple occasions. We will review the situation. We won't hesitate to take strong action to protect Australians, as we've done in the past, and that's what we'll do.
Do you support your colleague's idea? I think Dan Tehan, the shadow immigration spokesperson, put out the idea that there should be a question about anti-Semitism on the citizenship test.
Yeah, I think that's a very appropriate proposal, Patricia. We've seen horrible acts of violence against the Jewish community. Just outside my own electorate, we saw a synagogue defaced with references to Hitler and swastikas, and we've seen even worse conduct in other places, such as the Adass Synagogue in Melbourne. And so that fundamental value of religious tolerance, it's who we are as a country. And so if people aren't willing to sign up to that or to accept that, why should they become citizens? So yes, I think that's very reasonable.
So would you broaden it out? Would there be a question about tolerance of other religions, races?
Look, I think the general point about tolerance is very important, and what Dan has announced today is in relation to anti-Semitism, where we have seen very clear evidence of a very significant problem, which of course started on October the 9th at the Opera House, and the government's response to that was to do absolutely nothing. So that is the announcement that Dan has made today. But the broader point that you're making, Patricia, that tolerance of all faiths, tolerance of people of all backgrounds, absolutely. I mean, that's who we are as a country, and that pluralism, that fact that you can worship any God you want or no God at all, that's a big part of who we are. We must always protect that, we must always defend that, and we must always stand up to defend that right.
So to be clear, you think that it should be broader than just anti-Semitism. In the citizenship test, should it ask about Islamophobia, for instance? Should it be broader that way?
Well, Patricia, as I said, the announcement that's been made today is in relation to anti-Semitism, but of course, all forms of discrimination are completely inappropriate.
Right, so would the citizenship test, I know I'm labouring the point, but that's what I do here, you know that. It's literally my job. Would the citizenship test also ask about, I don't know, homophobia, for instance? I mean, we have a thriving gay and lesbian population in Australia to ensure people don't have homophobic views. Is that the sort of thing you'd also ask about?
Well, again, Patricia, the announcements about anti-Semitism today, we've seen an incredibly serious problem with anti-Semitism in recent months. We've never seen anything like it in our country, certainly in my lifetime. And so we've made a very clear announcement on that. The broader point you make about tolerance, I completely agree. Tolerance is very important. It's part of who we are. And the announcement we're making today is focused on anti-Semitism and ensuring that people who come to our country understand the importance of that issue.
OK, but you broadly are in favour of a broader test yourself?
Patricia, again, I've answered your question on multiple occasions. The the proposal for the test is in relation to anti-Semitism. I support that. And of course, discrimination of any form is unacceptable.
Russia has said they'll pause attacking energy infrastructure in Ukraine. Isn't this sort of meaningless, given we're seeing right now, I think bombs are actually going off in Russia. There are, in Ukraine. There are reports right now that there's no cessation of fighting. Is it really meaningful what we're seeing come out of these talks?
It's a very fair question, Patricia. And look, the words of Vladimir Putin should be treated with the greatest degree of scepticism. He never keeps agreements, and he's a dictator who's been responsible for the death of many thousands of people. So treat everything he says with the world's largest grain of salt. I mean, if you're in Pokrovsk or you're in Toretsk or in Chasiv Yar at the moment and you're getting pounded by Russian drones, by Russian missiles, you certainly don't feel any benefit from what has been said about energy infrastructure. And of course, the attacks on energy infrastructure tend to be somewhat sporadic in nature. So I think we should be very sceptical about anything that President Putin says, frankly. And that's important, Patricia, because if we do get to a ceasefire, and hopefully we do, we need to be very sceptical about Vladimir Putin sticking to the terms of any ceasefire. And that's very significant when you've got a Prime Minister who is proposing to put Australian troops in harm's way, close to what would be whatever was the frozen front line of that conflict. So, yes, we should be very sceptical about things that President Putin says.
Just final question on another topic that's just breaking. American medical giants have attacked the $18 billion pharmaceutical benefits scheme in a plea to the US President Donald Trump to impose punitive tariffs on Australia because we subsidise medicines. Now, this has been something that both sides of politics have been committed to. What is your commitment to defending the PBS and not negotiating on any level with the Trump administration on this?
Well, of course, we fully support the PBS. It's been a very good thing for our country. The task for the government is to make sure in this feared second round of tariffs that things like the PBS, things like the beef industry and other issues aren't affected. We want the government to succeed, and clearly the US administration is focused on introducing more tariffs. We don't want that to happen. The issue we've got is we've got compromised advocates on the part of the government. We've got a Prime Minister who's obviously made disparaging comments about the President, as has the Foreign Minister, as has our Ambassador in the United States. We want them to succeed. We certainly support their efforts in doing so. And regardless of the fact that we're all very much in agreement that we're strongly opposed to these tariff proposals, we have to deal with the world as it is, not as we would like it to be. And our task is to do the best possible job in these negotiations. Unfortunately, to date, it hasn't been successful, but hopefully it will be in the future.
David Coleman, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Patricia.
Well, for some analysis on that interview and some of the day's political news, political reporter Tom Crowley joins me in Canberra. Hi, Tom.
Hi, PK.
Really interesting interview with David Coleman there. Interesting let's just start on this dual citizen referendum. Is there going to be a referendum?
Well, it seems sort of less and less likely by the hour, I think is probably the way that I'd put it. It's interesting to sort of watch the choreography of these things. When you watch a lot of press conferences, read a lot of media releases, as we do in this line of work, you can tell when things are planned and you can tell when things are being done in a slapdash on the run kind of way. And the way that you can tell is when the language evolves. Really interesting that as soon as this Nine Newspapers report came along, Dutton was out there straight away saying, yep, we're doing this. His front bench was sounding a lot less enthusiastic about that. In this case, he's been sort of pulled back to their position. Sometimes we've seen the opposite happen, where Angus Taylor, Susan Lee, David Coleman, people like this are sort of playing catch up and they end up where their leader is. But as we had reported by my colleagues Jacob Grieber and Olivia Casely this morning, quite a few frustrations and people taken by surprise within coalition ranks by this one. Maybe that's why what began as a proposal, yes, let's have a referendum straight away, has turned into a little bit of wishy-washy one. I thought it was difficult in what David Coleman was saying there to determine exactly that question you were asking him about when the timing of this thing would be. It's sort of been distilled now really to an announceable. But yeah, it's an interesting, I mean, I remember when Labor was grappling to get ahead of the cost of living kind of conversation, and they were throwing out media releases about chip packets and shrinkflation and all sorts of things to try and seize the day. There's been a feeling about that in the last week or two, I think, from the coalition, that they're really kind of grasping for a way to shift the conversation, and almost every day it's a different thing, although none of them, mind you, seem to be about the cost of living. No,
and the cost of living consistently is the number one issue for people. One other issue, Dan Tehan has also, he's the Shadow Immigration Minister. I put to David Coleman a proposal from Dan Tehan in relation to asking about anti-Semitism or Jewish people in your citizenship test and whether it should be wider. What did you make of his answer?
Yeah, it was an interesting answer, wasn't it? I mean, it just shows, again, these are the kind of positions that you end up in when you're doing things on the fly, frankly. And this is where I think quite often what we've seen from the opposition, and look, you know, the bar is slightly different for an opposition no matter which party is in opposition, in terms of there always is some scope for things to change and evolve. More specifically, when you're in government, when you've got the public service to work with, you could work up a proposal in the proper way. But even so, we tend to hold an opposition to a higher standard than, for example, any sort of minor party or crossbencher, just in terms of the number of resources that they've got. And there have been quite a few times, I think, where the opposition leader or the opposition in general have started off with something, and then when press said, oh, look, you know, we'll think about all these things in the appropriate time, perhaps in government. And that was the tone of the answer there when you're asking about questions on homophobia, questions on other types of Australian values. I'm not sure we have an answer. I'm not sure any answer exists, or that these things have been fleshed out all that much. I thought that was pretty well exposed there.
Now, there's a story that's just breaking that American medical giants have basically made a formal complaint about the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. They want the US President Donald Trump to look at, they say basically it's a punitive system. They want it overturned. Now, this won't surprise you, Tom, or me, or probably lots of our viewers, because they've been going after the PBS for a long time. We like to heavily subsidise medicines in this country, and I think many Australians like it that way, that we have access to cheaper medicines. It's a bipartisan view. We've had governments fight very hard for this in the past, but this is going to be another battle with the Trump administration now.
It's going to be another battle for sure, and it makes me wonder what other things there are sort of hidden in what our government does that might be next on the list. Of course, the thing about the PBS is because the government is acting essentially as one big purchaser with a whole lot of market power, is essentially how, or the opposite of market power. They're the one consumer if you want to sell these medicines to Australia by and large, and so they're able to command a lower price. If that sort of thing is in the view of the Trump administration when it comes to these kind of economic talks, I guess it just reminds you we are in this totally, vastly different world where our number one ally and a significant trade partner is looking at basically every little bargain that we get, and basically anything that's beneficial for us out of our trading relationship with the United States. It's worth saying it's not as if American pharmaceutical companies are making a loss out of the drugs that our government buys from them. You know, these prices are by negotiation. Plenty of health bureaucrats in Australia who will tell you that Australia could be getting a better deal on medicine and actually using its buying power in a more forthright kind of way to get deals from these big pharmaceutical companies. In general, the PBS sometimes slow to adopt generics when they're available, and a few things like that sometimes mean that we pay more for medicines than we otherwise would. So, you know, obviously when you're sitting across the Pacific Ocean in the White House, it looks a little different. But, you know, I feel sorry for any government, and this is where I think, you know, for both the government and the opposition, you've just got to be ready for anything. I think to be able to say, oh, you know, either political party could fly over to Washington and get this sorted out, you know, you put out one fire and another one starts.
We are really in rocky times, but I don't think anyone wants us to mess with the PBS. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, PK.
Well, the opposition has accused the federal government of deliberately delaying giving Woodside the green light to extend the life of its North West Shelf gas plant until 2070. The WA government has already approved a 50-year extension of the LNG project, but Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek is yet to approve the new timeline. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese dismissed the idea of fast-tracking it and says the coalition is making up policy on the run.
We'll go through that process in accordance with the law. Do we support the gas sector? Yes, but subject, of course, to environmental approvals. This is just another, I said yesterday when the coalition came up with their second plan for a referendum next term that it was a thought bubble. Well, it's a thought bubble without the thought. It's really like a soap bubble because it lasts about as long as a bit of a soap bubble that comes up from a bubble bath or something. It just disappears into the ether within hours.
Peter Dutton says he'll make sure the approval of the gas plant's extension is arrived at within a month of securing office.
There is no conceivable reason as to why approval can't be given, except if you've got a minister who is beholden to Green voters in inner city Sydney and Melbourne and putting the interests of those Green voters over the interests of WA. That won't be an experience of our government. We will have a strong minister in John O'Doniam, and we will make sure that this approval is arrived at in 30 days.
Well, to discuss this and other issues, the Nationals Senate leader, Bridget McKenzie, is my guest. Bridget McKenzie, welcome.
Hey, PK, how are you going?
Good, thank you. Let's start on the northwest gas shelf. Sorry, a few words there. The coalition is pledging to introduce a national interest test for projects subject to environmental approvals. Does that mean environmental approvals won't matter?
No, not at all, PK. We don't want to weaken our environmental laws. We want to make them, be applied more quickly so that we actually ensure that projects like the North West Shelf gas extension can be opened up, that our trading partners can get the resource that they need, and that we can actually ensure that Australian energy supplies are secure for decades to come. This project is so important, not just to our bottom line in WA and that economy, but obviously to our national economic future going forward. And having it held up through third parties, being able to retrospectively come in and make claims when they're not even seriously impacted or affected by these types of projects is a problem. So we want strong environmental laws. We're proud of that. We indeed put a lot of them in place when we've been in past governments. But we need to have an approval process that works for industry, works to keep jobs on shore, and ensures that we can keep our energy supply secure into coming decades.
What does requiring a strengthened consideration of the economic and social benefits of projects mean then? Like, how do you strengthen that? Because it's already a consideration.
Well, people's jobs are able to be overridden. We're seeing instances where projects are being hauled back in for reconsideration and recontestation by environmental activists. That's what you're seeing under the Labor Party. That's what you will see more of when the Labor Party is in government with the Greens and with the Teal independents. We've already seen Teals come out and say that our announcement's reckless. We've already seen the Greens say that the Environment Minister should have already blocked this project. That's what you're going to see in a future Teal Albanese Green government. And we're saying, as the alternative to that, that we won't be anti-mining, we're not anti-resources, and we're not anti-WA. We are going to fast-track approvals in 30 days when they meet the national interest test, because we need to get this pipeline of projects going so that we can secure our economic and energy security over coming decades.
So in this particular instance with this particular project, within 30 days, Peter Dutton promises it'll be dealt with. But isn't he effectively giving pre-approval? And doesn't that create a legal risk then? I mean, it will inevitably be contested if he's kind of set out those terms in such a blatant way.
Well, we've already made it pretty clear whose side we're on. Well, I mean, we're defunding the Environmental Defenders Office, who are often the environmental activists that are shutting down projects and leaving communities like I represent in the National Party bereft of local jobs that are intergenerational and aren't just providing local benefit to that region, but are literally keeping people warm in our trading partners like Tokyo, for instance, when you're talking about our gas industry. We've got environmental activists sitting in Tanya Plibersek's own seat, raising these types of issues, tying these projects up in, court action and the like, that we need to see an end to. We don't make any, equivocation about that. We want strong environmental standards, frameworks and regulations, but we're not going to sit on projects. And let's face it, Tanya Plibersek has to face up to the conflict of interest she inherently has by holding this portfolio, because her main target each and every election isn't the Liberal Party, isn't the National Party, it's actually the Greens. And so she needs to be
not a conflict of interest.
That
that's
she is out-greening
Senator.
the Greens on this.
Senator, that's like saying that you should never...
We've got Tanya Plibersek
That is like saying that because the Nationals, for instance, represent rural seats, you can't hold the agriculture portfolio because you have a conflict of interest. I mean, that's not logical, is it?
Well, PK, people have said for a long time we shouldn't be investing in regional Australia if you're the National Party is in government. I mean, this is the sort of
and you always argue against
tangles
that.
We get ourselves in.
You always argue against it. So the point is, it's not a conflict of interest.
And our community agrees with us.
It's not a conflict of interest for her to represent her electorate, is it?
What it is clearly for Tanya Plibersek as the Environment Minister, it's in her own electoral interests, holding an inner city seat in Sydney, versus the interests of Western Australians and the Western Australian mining and resources industry. Those two proponents, shall we say, when she comes to making her decisions, are not on the same page. So we've simply today announced what we're backing, and we're backing swift, strong environmental assessments on national interest projects like this one, and we're going to get that done within 30 days. Now, if it meets the approvals, it can go ahead. If it doesn't, it won't. What we're committing to is making sure that the assessment itself is done in a swift manner rather than tying these projects up in long, expensive and protracted delays, which is exactly what the environmental activists have been looking to do over recent years.
Just a couple of quick ones on the other issues that have been doing the rounds, one of them being a referendum. Do you want to see a referendum on dual citizens being deported essentially by ministers in the next term if you win?
Well, I want to keep Australians safe and address the cost of living crisis, and that's exactly what we're going to do. So we've made it really clear over the last 2 years the measures that we're going to adopt when it comes to that. It is the Labor Party who has got us into the predicament where we have visa holders perpetrating crimes in our suburbs around the country. We've got dual citizens who potentially are, committing heinous crimes, and we have no recourse. So what we've actually committed to is taking seriously the fact that Australians have had enough of this type of behaviour. They want a government that takes action. They want to know their government has their back. And unlike Labor and unlike Anthony Albanese, we have put a plan on the table.
So what is the plan? That's what I'm trying to get. What is the plan?
Well, all options are on the table, including, if we have to, looking at a referendum. And I don't see a problem with that, PK. I mean, I find it quite, fascinating that we're not going after the Labor Party for allowing Hamas and Hezbollah sympathisers to wave symbols of terrorists on our suburban street. We're okay with our synagogues being firebombed, but we're somehow having a problem, have a grown-up conversation, maybe, if it's required, at some future date to keep Australians safe.
I think it's reasonable for people to know
deport dual citizens.
If we're going to have another referendum, though, that's reasonable that Australians want to know, are they going to be voting in a referendum in the next 3 years?
Well, I think I listened to a lot of the former Shadow Minister's response. I've, seen all colleagues' comments, and it is clear that it is one of the tools in the toolkit, shall we say, but it is going to be the last resort. What we want to do is keep Australians safe. We've made announcements right around the country around increasing CCTV footage in local communities. We've got a raft of announcements addressing the anti-Semitism crisis we're seeing, including standing up a task force that will include the AFP and a raft of state agencies as well to work together on this, because we have seen some states better at it than others. So right across the board, we want to keep Australians safe. The crime wave isn't just happening in Alice Springs, it's happening in our suburbs and regional capitals around the country. I've heard about it everywhere I've gone this week, out in the Cedar Hawk, up in Bendigo and the like, as you can see in Victoria alone. And so we're serious about doing something about it.
Thank you so much for your time, Senator.
Always.
And here are the top stories we're following this half hour. Now, Peter Dutton says he'll make sure approval of the gas plant's extension is arrived at within a month of securing office. Here he is. I don't think we have that grab from Peter Dutton. Well, let me bring you this. As part of Peter Dutton's pledge to extend the North West gas shelf, he took aim directly at the independent MP for Curtin in WA, Kate Chaney, who says scrutiny needs to be applied to the approval process of the gas plant.
I think people in Curtin were duped at the last election when they heard Kate Chaney say that she was a disaffected Liberal. Kate Chaney is a hardcore Green, and I don't believe that the people of Curtin want Kate Chaney to continue with this process of deception.
Let's bring in Kate Chaney herself, who is only one half of our political panel today, along with Labor MP for Macquarie, Susan Templeman. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, PK.
Well, Kate, I kind of have to start with you. Peter Dutton has singled you out here in relation to the North West gas shelf and the way you're representing your community. He says you're a hardcore Green, are you?
Well, I think we're going to get a lot of name-calling from Peter Dutton, because that's really all he's got. He's shown today he does not understand the WA economy and where its future lies, saying he's going to repeal the production tax credits that mean so much to our future prosperity, and also shown he doesn't understand how approval processes work. You can't do a process in 30 days. We need to actually look at the relevant information and make a decision on all the facts, not just rush it through.
You had previously labelled the WA government's approval of the North West Shelf as a terrible decision and urged the Federal Environment Minister, Tanya Plibersek, to knock it back. You've since changed your mind. So do you support the extension of this project?
Yeah, I didn't actually change my mind, although that's the way it was reported. What I said was these projects shouldn't go through unless we are fully accounting for carbon. We have a robust offsets program, and we've addressed the environmental issues and heritage issues. Now, we're still working through that process with the North West Shelf, and the federal process looks at different issues to the state process. We haven't yet come to a conclusion as to whether or not there are environmental and heritage issues that would prevent this project from, on balance, being good for Australia. And we need to see that process continue to roll through. And if, in fact, there is any clue, if it looks like a decision has been made before all the relevant information has been taken into account, it's just going to open it to legal challenge. So Peter Dutton is really doing himself no favours here by questioning the approval process that we're currently working through.
Susan, has the government allowed this to be an issue by pushing the deadline on this into possible caretaker mode?
Well, I think the extension for consideration goes to just how complex this project is. And really what this whole issue is showing is that the Liberals and Nationals are prepared to throw out the rules. They're prepared to give verbal approval for something before it's been through any process and then say, oh, in 30 days we'll tick the box. And that is, as Kate has said, it's a recipe for legal challenges, but it is also an appalling way to be in government. government. It's what we saw from them in their last term. You know, robo-debt. Let's not follow the rules. Let's make them up. And I think it just goes to the heart of their attitude to say or do whatever it takes, particularly in this pre-election campaign. But it's a recipe for appalling environmental decisions. And we will obviously work through as efficiently as possible so that the decision that the minister makes, and remember, she's not allowed to prejudge. The law says she can't prejudge, and we will follow those laws.
I just want to ask you, just as a follow-up, the Coalition also, Susan, wants to introduce a national interest test for projects that are subject to environmental approvals. Would that be something that you could support?
I think it depends which bit of national interest that they're talking about. I mean, I'm very sceptical about people who have had nearly a decade in government until fairly recently coming up with this sort of stuff as excuses to push things through that may not pass environmental standards, even pass the existing environmental standards, let alone the improved environmental standards that we want to see. So, you know, it all depends, doesn't it? And to hear just before us, Bridget McKenzie trying to explain what it was, I'm not any clearer about what it is, how it would work, and in whose interests it would work.
Yeah, Kate Chaney, just final question to you on this. You've described this idea of fast-tracking and the timeframes as sort of from the Donald Trump playbook. How is it from the Donald Trump playbook? I mean, it seems kind of consistent with the general policy approach that I think we've heard from the Coalition for some time, isn't it?
Well, for a start, I think it is policy on the fly, like we're seeing from Donald Trump. I mean, I don't think this is very well thought through, thinking about, you know, let's just ignore the processes and say we'll do it and get it done in 30 days. Not only does it open that legal issue, but it also really undermines the fact that if you're making decisions that have 50-year implications for our kids and our grandkids, it makes sense to look at all the information and make sure that they're informed decisions, not quick decisions. Now, this won't affect any gas to come on before 2030. It's not like this is holding things up. And we need to make reasonable long-term decisions, not snap short-term decisions for political benefit. So in that way, I think it's quite consistent with what we're seeing coming out of the US at the moment. And we're seeing again and again Peter Dutton testing Donald Trump lines and seeing which of them fly with the Australian public. But I think the Australian public wants to see sensible decisions made for the long term, not short-term political decisions.
Should the citizenship test change, Susan, to ask questions about anti-Semitism?
Well, this just follows on from the whole referendum, the thought bubble yesterday. I don't know what tomorrow's will be, but none of this is clear about what it's achieving. What is the problem it's trying to solve? We have laws in place to deal with people who do appalling things that are anti-Semitic. We've increased laws to make sure that Nazi symbols can't be used. So we have a whole series of laws that apply to everybody, whether they're citizens or non-citizens. And it isn't, again, I've been keeping an ear on things this afternoon, and when David Coleman talked about it, I don't actually know how it would work. And why are we singling out one religion? You know, everybody should be respected, no matter what their religion. So anything that you're going to put into citizenship tests should be really working with people to ensure that there is a respect, no matter what someone's religion or background is.
Kate Chaney, is there anything wrong with asking that question or trying to ensure that people come here with values which are not discriminatory?
I think this is completely out of the Trump playbook as well. It is a distraction. This is Peter Dutton trying to pick a culture war to distract from the fact that he really is very short on policy on the big issues that people care about, like housing, like decarbonisation, like cost of living. And to start talking about a referendum on an issue that I think is peripheral and does not actually solve the problem is just more distraction, and I don't think people will fall for it.
Just to a breaking story, which I consider, and I bet all our viewers agree, extremely significant, and that's the price of medicines in our country and our excellent PBS. The US industry has named Australia's PBS as one of the egregious and discriminatory programs to be targeted in Trump's imminent decision on reciprocal tariffs, blaming our policy for cutting prices and blocking American exporters. That is now obviously going to be the next front of a fight with the Trump administration potentially. Susan Templeman, I just would love to get your views on how your government is going to handle this.
Well, we are not going to be giving an inch on the PBS and cheaper medicines. You know, this is something that's been around for more than 75 years, is when it started. It's got stronger and stronger, and we're the ones. It's Labor who's made it stronger. So we will be, that is not something that will be open to negotiation. Not only is cheaper medicine a key part of the things that we've done to help people from cost of living, but it's building on that foundation, which means it's not your credit card that determines the access you get to most medicines. And we're always adding more to that PBS. But this is just a fundamental part of how we get equity in Australia's health system. So, you know, it might be the Americans might want to see us go down the path where people go bankrupt because they're trying to pay for medication, but that is not a path that we will take a single step down.
Yeah, well, I think that it is a very, very well-supported position. Kate, I'll give you the final word on this. It's going to be clearly very difficult for the government as it goes into this battle.
Yeah, that's right. And I think we have to be calm and careful in the context of the uncertainty globally. We have a deep interest in protecting free trade principles wherever possible, and Australia needs to keep thinking about our own national interest and the fact that we don't want to get into any tariff wars, and we have to do what we can to protect those free trade principles.
I want to thank you both. You've been great panellists. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Patricia.
And here are our top stories this hour.
Thank you.
Vladimir Putin has agreed to stop attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure for 30 days. Mr. Putin rejected a proposal for a full and permanent ceasefire, demanding the US and its allies stop providing arms and military intelligence to Kiev. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says he will probably support the proposal but needs more details. Canada plans to buy an advanced radar system developed in Australia, which would become this country's largest ever defence export deal. The United States has been expected to purchase the world-leading technology first. But after Donald Trump's return to the White House, Canada has stepped up and ahead of its southern neighbour. Now, the deal is worth $6.5 billion. The opposition leader says he wants to approve a major extension to a Woodside gas plant in Western Australia within 30 days if he wins the upcoming federal election. The state government has already approved a 50-year extension to the project. Meanwhile, the Albanese government has until March the 31st to approve the extension. Well, we're 1 week out from the federal budget. That was a budget that we weren't planning to have, and I suspect will be very much the direct precursor to the Prime Minister then going to the Governor-General and officially calling the election. We don't know, of course, what the date is, but we suspect it will be the 3rd or the 10th of March. He could go on the 17th as well, but we think the 3rd or the 10th is the most likely date he will call it for, which means with the interruption, I think, of Easter and Anzac Day, where I think usually campaigning goes a little quiet, it will be all hands on deck. All the politicians will be campaigning to be re-elected, and there are new players, of course, as well. But there have been some interesting developments in the last week or so. We've got Peter Dutton making announcements that some of his backbenchers, it appears, have been not necessarily on board with. There have been captain's picks in some ways that are causing some controversy. And then on the other side of politics, there's been not too much excitement yet, but some positive signs for Labor that perhaps the Prime Minister is recovering his approval in the polls. So let's get in some of the people who have been in the cut and thrust of politics for a very long time. No offence to them, not ageing them at all. Former Labor advisor Ryan Liddell, who I've known for far too long. Former Liberal advisor David Gazard, who I've also known for too long. Welcome to both of you.
Hi, Patricia. Thanks for that.
Don't mean to make you feel bad, guys, but got to be honest sometimes. OK. There's been many conversations we've had as an organisation. I've had some of these too with many senior coalition figures, and they're not too red hot with excitement about this idea of a referendum to give unconstrained power to politicians to deport criminals who are dual nationals. So, David, I have to go to you first. We've got very high-profile people, including a former Attorney General, saying this is not a good idea. Why are they not all singing from the same song sheet?
Well, we've probably all seen quite a few referendums come and go, seeing as we've been around for so long and have so much grey hair. Although I've got to say that Ryan, you are looking stunningly good today.
He is. He's a handsome man.
As ever.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I appreciated him telling me the same before we went on air. The history of referendums is that they don't traditionally do well. They suck up a lot of oxygen. I don't necessarily think Peter Dutton was saying he'd have a referendum. I think it kind of goes to his position as someone who cares very deeply about the law, being a former policeman. And he sort of couched it as, we could consider this along with a whole range of other measures. So, the Liberal Party, for all its strengths around independence, one of those strengths is that backbenchers in particular feel free to speak their mind, and so you're always getting a bit of chatter across the backbench about any particular idea that comes forward, and this one, has obviously been canvassed because we're seeing a range of things that are developing on a day-by-day basis where the leader of the opposition got asked about it.
Yeah, he did, but there's been a few, I'm going to stay with you, there's been a few stories which have been, haven't gone down too well for the opposition leader. Do you see some trouble in that campaign?
Look, one of the things I think that's building up with a bit of pent-up pressure is the fact that we haven't seen the budget yet. And we know this was a budget that Jim Chalmers, Treasurer, did not really want to deliver because it is going to contain a sea of red ink. So the coalition have been at pains to say, look, we're not going to make a whole range of promises that may be unfunded given the state of the budget, but that's led to a lot of pent-up demand in an election cycle to say, well, what are we going to announce? So I think a lot of that pressure will be released next Tuesday when we see the budget, and it'll give, obviously, Peter Dutton a chance in the budget reply to spell out where he sees the coalition going, which should go a long way to salving some of those concerns around policy release.
Ryan, you've been very senior in an opposition leader's office, so you know how it works around this time. What's your read of what's going on?
Well, as one Labor strategist said to me, Patricia, over the past couple of weeks, or the past couple of months, people have been looking at Peter Dutton and the way he's been presenting himself as an alternative Prime Minister, and there were a bit of nerves, in some parts of the Labor Party, but as it was put to me, you sort of scratch below the surface, and it's good to see Captain Crackers is still sitting there coming up with some crazy ideas like this dual-citizenship referendum. We've been, David and I have been on this show repeatedly talking about cost of living being first, second, third, fourth, fifth most important issue. And no wonder Labor MPs are out there, no wonder coalition MPs are out there backgrounding against their leader and their treasurer when they're out there, when their leaders out there talking about things like this, when all they want is some economic policy. All they want is something to be able to talk about in relation to cost of living, to tell voters in their electorates to vote for them. Is coming out with things like this, coming out with these ideas on passport control, around anti-Semitism, all sorts of ideas. These things that the MPs don't need. What they need is an economic plan to talk to voters about.
Yeah, David, that is an issue. I mean, I know you said there'll be pressure taken off next week because the focus will be on the government, and you are right. Next week will be a very focused week on the government because they're the ones delivering the budget. But then there's a budget and reply speech, and I suspect it can't all be about things like national security. People do want an economic narrative.
They will, but before we move on to that, I want to take exception with what Ryan has just said around law and order and security more generally. And the response to anti-Semitism and some of our immigration policies and the shambles we've seen about people who are out on ankle bracelets or not recognised at all about where they are in the community, after they've been given visas in an unchecked way by this government is certainly a concern in the community. We've seen the government change in the Northern Territory around law and order issues, very clear law and order issues that have extended to riots on the streets in Alice Springs, problems in Darwin. Law and order was an enormous issue in the last Queensland election, where the government changed hands. And anyone who's been reading the papers in Victoria can see that bail reform and law and order issues are enormous there. I would also say that law and order is a massive, massive issue in most country areas. So I don't think this is a debate that most people in Australia would not be welcoming. Now, you've got ongoing policy reform that's going on there. It is a coalition strength to deal with security. And all of these entrench Peter Dutton's leadership coming from a former Defence and Home Affairs minister in previous governments, as well as being a policeman in a former life. So it's one of the areas I think the public tend to trust Peter Dutton, before they even start thinking about economic policy, which does. I mean, it is an important thing. Cost of living is massive at the moment, but that you don't overlook the bread and butter issues of law and order and security for the public either. No,
of course law and order matters to people, but right now all of the data shows that, people want cost of living relief. They want a story about what's next for the economy, right, Ryan? And that's a pressure, can I say, on your side of politics, Labor as well, to deliver that answer next week.
Absolutely.
That is really hard.
And it's not just people who want it, it's Liberal MPs that want it, and that's why they're telling journalists that they want it, Nothing says a party in dysfunction than having MPs sort of one-handing their leader and their treasurer through the pages of the Australian newspaper, Patricia. And this is next week will be an opportunity for the government, obviously, to set its narrative for the election coming through. Talk about the results of its responsible economic management insofar as getting inflation down to where it is while keeping the unemployment rate low. But it's also a real challenge for, I guess, the opposition leader. That the crescendo of the week with the budget's obviously on Tuesday night. Thursday night is that budget reply. Then we'll be fairly quickly into a campaign, I suspect. That's a real opportunity for the opposition leader to stand up and say, rather than talk about things like banning gambling advertising during footy games and stuff like that, what is his economic plan? Is it just long lunches? Will he back in a cost of living relief that the government is purported to be preparing in relation to energy bills? What is the economic plan? Okay. And I think there'll be as many people on the government side asking that as there are on the opposition leader's side. All right,
just want to end on a story that I think will be a very big one in the next couple of weeks, and that's the Trump administration being lobbied by, guess what, Big Pharma, to deal with the unfairness of our PBS, where we use our enormous buying power to suppress prices and deliver cheaper medicines to our citizens, something our citizens quite like. David, that's going to be a big fight with the Trump administration, briefly.
Yeah, I think so. I don't think there'd be anyone in politics that wouldn't want to change that. And you're absolutely right. The PBS manages to get medicines in an affordable form, even though they're incredibly expensive in many instances, but they wrestle pharmaceutical companies into a place where they're the most affordable possible by buying in bulk. And that is a good thing for Australian citizens. I don't think I've heard anyone ever complain about that. And it's something that health ministers of either side have done for ages and will continue to do for ages.
And Ryan, that's going to be the next roadblock, isn't it, for your side, for the Labor government to try and be really hardline about this and say don't mess with our PBS?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's good to see, Minister Butler and the Shadow Minister Andrew Rushton come out defending the integrity of the PBS. But just quickly, on a domestic political front, if this sort of starts to rear its head during the campaign, health and protecting Medicare is a real sort of sweet spot for the government. Be able to talk about the cheaper medicines they're delivering, have delivered and continue to deliver, which puts them in a positive position in that respect. Oh, that's an interesting perspective. Let's see. It does put the PBS front and centre, but a lot has to play out still in terms of those negotiations. As usual, lovely to see your handsome selves, whatever colour your hair is. Thank you.
Thanks, PK.
Thanks, PK.
And that's afternoon briefing for today. That was a joke in relation to a hair colour joke at the beginning there. That's it from the program. If you want to see the program and you could only see the last bit, you can go to iView, search for afternoon briefing, and the whole episode comes up and you can see our many interviews, including with the shadow foreign spokesperson for the coalition. David Coleman joined me to talk about some of these big conflicts we're seeing in the world. Ukraine, the end of the ceasefire, it looks like, in Gaza. That's all there on ABC iView. Stay with us here on ABC News Now. The lovely Joe O'Brien is up next with today's top stories. I'll be back on your television at 4 o'clock tomorrow. You can live stream the show, of course, as well. Have a terrific evening. See you then.